Hello, I think that people are starting to trickle in. Christina, are you here? Not yet. Hi, everyone. Just waiting to be joined by Christina. Hi, Christina. Can you hear me? Hi, Christina. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, and I'll start the video right away. So.
No problem. It was a bit tricky to get over here.
Yes, it was indeed.
We can't quite see it. I can't see it yet, Christina. I don't know if you...
Yeah, it's a problem with the Zoom. Can you hear me at least?
Yes, I can hear you.
Or yes.
We can just start with the audio if you're having trouble with the camera.
Yes.
I'm sure it's fine. Should we go ahead and start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. As you already heard, I'm Scott Griffin. I'm the Deputy Director at the International Press Institute. We're a global press freedom organization based in Vienna. As you may have heard during Christina's excellent overview, IPI has been tracking attacks on the press during the pandemic, since the start of the pandemic, in fact, and looking in particular at, in general, the impact of the pandemic on both press freedom, but also on independent journalism and on the economic stability of the media. And I think, as Christina already mentioned, some of our statistics, but between February 2020 and May 2021, we recorded 677 press freedom violations linked to COVID-19 around the world, and that is indeed just the tip of the iceberg. In a way, it's difficult, obviously, to collect every single example, but we collected enough information to understand the types of threats that journalists are facing and the types of challenges the media face. And these include, as we already heard, on the one hand, retaliation against media for covering the pandemic, which took many different forms. We had journalists arrested in some cases for digging into government responses to the pandemic. We had verbal attacks against journalists. We had physical attacks against journalists, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic. We had restrictions on access to information. In some countries, journalists being prevented from speaking to healthcare workers or accessing data related to the pandemic. We had a whole new series of laws related to fake news that in many cases were used or were designed to prevent journalists from reporting on critical topics. We had journalists being prevented from reporting on the ground, from reporting from healthcare facilities, from reporting about lockdowns, as we already heard. We also had issues related to surveillance. We know that surveillance has greatly increased during the pandemic, in some cases related to needs of controlling the virus, in other cases not. And that's an issue that's going to be with us for a long time. But as we have a very short amount of time here, those of you who are in the room are very much invited to ask questions and get involved. We would like to have sort of an active discussion. So go ahead and start doing that. You're welcome to turn on your cameras as well. But I'd like just to start one more with another prompt to Christina. I've mentioned some of these press freedom issues. You mentioned as well also the fact that there is increased opportunities for political interference in the media due to state aid being made available to lessen the economic crisis. I was wondering if you can give us a little bit more of a detailed picture of what went on in Albania, but also in the wider region. Some examples that come to your mind about serious challenges to press freedom and being able to report on the pandemic.
Yes, it has like different, it takes different approaches. In many countries where there are already programs of subsidies towards media, they were, let's say, increased, and sometimes they were favoring only media that are pro-government, and especially in the Balkan region. In Albania, when we usually don't have governmental aid programs, aid support towards media, there were other alternatives that were used by government in order to support. So from the data that we uncovered during our investigation through loans that the state provided to different businesses with no interest or very, very low interest, we discovered that most of them went to businesses related to mainstream media, to owners of mainstream media, which means, of course, that they are favored towards other alternative media, and of course, to continue with businesses that, let's say, provide these pro-government media with financial support. In other countries, even in Europe, we have to report when media that are only pro-government were supported through such subsidies. And of course, there are other obligations in order to report over governmental, let's say, conferences or press releases, and not to provide independent reporting, especially in relation to COVID pandemic data.
Thanks for that. Indeed, this was an issue that I observed as well in a number of countries, especially those where there already were problems with the provision of different forms of state aid to the media. And we found that this crisis actually just made things worse, basically, because you had so much more money flowing in, and it just followed the similar tracks and similar patterns of favoritism towards pro-government media. So it was a big issue as well. You mentioned, you referred to that instances where it's difficult for journalists to be able to, they were prevented from covering parliamentary activities, from court activities, and yet we relied so much on journalists to do their jobs during the pandemic, to give us information about the health crisis. How would you sort of rate the resilience of journalism in your region in Albania when it comes to sort of surviving this period of restrictions, of lockdowns, of difficulties in accessing information? Was the media able to really come through in this period despite the challenges?
Yes and no. I mean, one of the examples that came in my mind while I was giving this challenge, explaining these challenges, was related exactly to the access that journalists had during the pandemic in the court cases. For example, the Special Court on Organized Crime in Albania decided that because of the COVID measures to restrict the access of all journalists, but at the same time, they didn't guarantee any other way of following the court cases. And we are talking here about court cases toward organized crime or high-level corruption. So unfortunately, what we have seen in the following months is even though the physical distances restriction, let's say, became less than in previous year, at least in 2020, such restrictions in entering or getting access into court session, for example, continue to exist in Albania, even though you have now parliamentary sessions, etc. At some point, the parliament in Albania decided also to limit the physical access of journalists into their parliamentary sessions. So they decided that because they will air the parliamentary commissions and discussions online, that is enough in order to guarantee the public access. But of course, because of the journalists reacted so much towards such decision, this restriction or new regulation was cancelled. So journalists gained again access into the parliament. Of course, as we have seen not only in Albania but also in other countries, access to information, especially in data in relation to COVID, has been very problematic. So I don't think that journalists have had all the possibilities to properly inform the public on the situation, on the challenges, on number of people infected, on whole number of deaths, but also on measures that each government had taken towards against the pandemic. And especially with the vaccination process, because we have seen a total centralization of the messages. As you know, in Albania, our prime minister has his own TV station that goes live on Facebook. So having as a justification the COVID pandemic, they blocked all the direct communication and press releases with journalists. So they decided to use only this governmental run media in order to deliver the messages or possible restriction toward the pandemic, as well as vaccination data. During the initial months of the pandemic, unfortunately, every Albanian and as well as journalists had to follow live streaming of the our prime minister for hours and hours in order to understand which were the restrictions posed the day or enforced for the upcoming month. So even though journalists try to use Freedom of Information Act also to, let's say, appeal almost all the refusals to the Commissioner of Freedom of Information, and in some cases, they were able to reveal data about COVID or subsidies that governments have provided, not only to media, but also to other companies or vulnerable groups. Unfortunately, many of those data still remain uncovered all over the Balkans, but I think that is the situation also in other countries, even in Europe, and we have seen some very problematic cases also.
Indeed, and it was interesting that the IPI has our IJ4EU fund for investigative journalism, cross-border investigative journalism, and I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we were deciding whether to whether to start the program really, because it was right at the beginning and then we were debating, is this the right time? But in the end, we decided actually there's never been a more important time. Journalists need these resources. There's so many stories that need to be told right now. Like the potential for with all of this money and all of the data and the health crisis, so much potential for corruption, for abuse of power. It's all there, and we need investigative journalism more than ever. So it's really sort of interesting to hear how journalism was able to navigate to some extent these extremely difficult conditions. I want to, as we have very limited time, also to come to another topic that you spent some time talking about, which is the financial impact on the media. And we know that, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I heard one editor describe it to me, every day is election day, basically, in the sense that there's so much traffic coming to media sites, there's so much readership, and yet the revenue has completely disappeared. Advertising bottomed out completely. And obviously it had a huge impact on media everywhere. And you mentioned that also this impact, but also some opportunities that came out of it in terms of digital innovation. How do you sort of now, almost 2 years since the start of the pandemic, how do you see this process? I mean, has the impact been, long-term negative, or are we starting to see at least some, positive developments coming out of it in terms of this innovation you mentioned? Are there specific examples that you could share with us that sort of give you a little bit of optimism that, we may see something good in terms of media innovation come out of this?
I would say yes and no, and I'll justify my response. Yes, because we have seen that most of the media, even the mainstream media, have now launched fact-checking services, which is very important. Some of them have created online applications in order to connect to their audiences, but also to gather data from the public. So especially this kind of application in involving citizens and readers into the daily reporting has been very important for local media, which unfortunately have been even more impacted by the lack of revenue or advertisement during this period. But why I am hesitant is because, and I don't know if it will be a positive result at the end, because I've seen that even though media has used some innovative approaches, I've seen also government and political actors to be even more active in and more innovative in their ways of communication. So I'm afraid that unfortunately the use of social media by politicians or the limited access to public documents or public hearings will continue for years to come. And of course, this is not a good precedent for the media, and it will continue to be used in the next years. For example, in the last elections that we had in the parliamentary election in 25th of April, the government and all political parties used the COVID restriction not to organize rallies, but just to restrict access of journalists in those rallies, which resulted in political parties providing pre-edited videos, which then were aired live in TVs or during the news edition as the only source of information what was going on with the candidates, with their electoral promises, etc. So we saw political parties and both local and central governmental institutions now to have developed huge newsrooms on their own in order to provide ready-made and pre-edited videos for the media. And so let's see what will be the results. We still hope that there will be possibilities for media and journalists to regain some of the, let's say, rights and freedoms that they had before the pandemic, but it is needed a lot of support, not only from the media community, but especially from other activists and especially from the public.
Before I ask the last question, let me see if anybody who's with us in the room has a question for you. I don't see anything in the chat, but if you would like to ask a question, feel free to turn on your camera and microphone and pose your question to Christina. We just have, I think, 3 minutes before we have to go back, before we have to go into the room. I don't see anyone raising their hand, so maybe I'll just pick up on what you were saying at the very end about also the public. You know, the fact that we have, you were sort of describing the fact that, you know, politicians have discovered their own ways of creating media, their own newsrooms, using, you know, live or direct communication with people. Does that also have to do with a loss of trust in the media? And has that declined over the course of the pandemic? And is there anything that media are doing to sort of push back against that and try to explain why critical media or critical filtering of government communication is something that we need in democracies? Is this discussion sort of taking place?
It's very relevant because, unfortunately, only in the last year's surveys, we have, at least for the Balkan region, we have noted a decrease in media. So the most trusted institution in reporting cases of corruption or in keeping government accountable around the region. It was not such a high level of trust, but in comparison with all other judicial or governmental institutions, media seem to be the most trusted institution, even in comparison with civil society organizations. And unfortunately, for the first time, we have seen a decline in all the countries of the region in regard to the media trust. Also, we have to be very careful in drafting policies and approaches for the future, because something else that we have to take into consideration is media literacy in the region, and also people trust in social media. Unfortunately, the latest data show that differently from the EU countries. For example, in Albania, more than half of the population believe that the information that they get from social media is trusted and is reliable. So politicians have used such context in order to advance their agenda, in order not to include any more journalists and media into the public discourse or into the press releases, but to communicate directly with the public by, of course, what is called right now propaganda, and having no filters by the media. So I'm sorry, because I think we are late.
Yes. No, thank you so much, Christina, and yeah, looking forward to continuing this a little bit in a big plenary discussion, but thank you so much for that short but extremely useful conversation. And yeah, see everybody on the other side. I think we need to use the link that we got before. I'm not sure, but
okay. I hope to see everybody.
I hope to see everybody
plenary session.
Again. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.